I start, I'd really like to say thank you to all of those who have invited me here today. The morning session has been so special, and thank you, Tony. I hold a universe in my hands. The maps of these memories filter journeys that bring to light new discoveries to behold, that lead me closer to the well of my heart. To search for comfort alone will surely obscure the true nature of life's complexities, and so the doors of myriad experiences are always left ajar, to let the flow of energies come and go at will. Fertile and fecund, I bear the fruits of my mother's garden in the pride of a female ancestry. Sitting to write this presentation, I felt disinclined to write about my work starting from its genesis alone, and so decided instead to put together facts from my life that I view as important choices pertaining to my personal world that has shaped my influences professionally. As my art is articulated from the experiences of my life and its surrounding context, and rooted within a feminist stance that is connected to all that is related to me, I believe you will be able to decipher the intentions of the work as you view it within the lecture today and comprehend the direction and territory of concerns that I work with as an artist through these last 4 decades. The visuals that I have selected for this presentation are not in a sequence of chronology of date, but are interspersed to offer insight into the ideational territories that I wish to share with you today. Childhood experiences are generally where the initial introduction of influences percolate, which remain within one's psyche long after one's childhood ends. I can trace early influences that came from the quiet nights where I lay drifting off to sleep as a child, whilst my mother would softly be conversing with her sisters and my grandmother on visits back to her ancestral home during the summer vacations. And I would hear them recounting stories and anecdotes of their lives, each lived with independence and with the courage of conviction, to stand up for what they believed in. And these became the lullabies that gifted to me strains from where to find my feminist belonging. I garnered great belief that my gender was of significance to both myself and to the world I belonged to, from the continuous reinforcements, endorsements of this by parents in so many different ways. And the narrative related to my conception is perhaps one of my favorite memories that illustrate this. The story I was told about my conception is that my mother argued for a second child, and I was conceived on a promise extracted by my father that the baby must be a girl. This anecdote offered me a plinth of belief upon which I could situate a comprehension of why and how, as a female child, I held significance both for myself and for the world around me, which paved the way for me to later embrace a feminist existence that could honor the legacies of chronicled and oral feminist endeavor with a conscious alertness. Homeschooled till I was the age of 7 as a result of recurring ill health, I was introduced through this seclusion into discovering my imagination and how it could become my escape into a larger world of belonging. I lived with my immediate family as my only social companions, along with our Persian cat Bimbo on remote Air Force bases, and as a result spent hours drawing and painting by myself. This seemingly simple occupational space became a vital lifeline in providing me a wandering ground that shaped my vision of communicating by providing me a lifelong tool to articulate with. My family held great value for education as the currency of self-progress. The privilege of receiving an education in a country where the disempowered have to struggle for basic survival and equality at all times, and often in terribly dehumanized conditions, was made known to me, and this awareness disallowed me to ever view education as a mere entitlement for those economically more solvent. And so I regard the labor of learning as an opportunity to always pursue, and with the intent of knowing how I will use the knowledge I receive beyond it merely serving my self-betterment. But I also quickly learned that information does not always translate to knowledge. The biggest mistake we make is that we do not encourage the purpose of direction to be sought through education, nor do we attempt to teach the value of how we could navigate the unfamiliar through informed instruction. Though professing to be a nation of multicultural heritage, my experience whilst growing up was finding myself repeatedly subjected to personal scrutiny regarding the hybridity of my regional and religious identity in unhealthy, overly curious ways. Catholicism and Zoroastrianism were the religious influences I was exposed to as a child, as my parents belonged to these territories from the families that they were born into. It is unfortunate but true that India and Indians, by and large, are not always accommodating to individuals who belong within multiple cultural ancestries. As an intercultural nuclear family of 4, with English as the only medium of collective communication amongst us, we represented in many ways the Nehruvian ideals of post-independent urban Indian modernity of that time. The exposure to diverse cultural practices via life on an Air Force base offered valuable insights into the dynamics of coexistence of plural identities that included marginalized representations as well. With compatibility between communities and religious groups stressed upon as implicit within the military, I was privy to witnessing different religions and their rituals at close quarters. In these interludes that offered me proximity to the displays of religious devotion, I was left disenchanted with its disconnect to the real world, as I found blind faith cumbersome. Therefore, at the age of 13, despite being relatively young, I chose to disengage myself from the interaction with religion because I found faith conflicted with the premises of scientific rational knowledge, and my family left me free to do so. This entry into embracing atheism was supported completely by my parents, who instructed the school to release me immediately from the study of theology that was part of the curriculum in the convent syllabi for students with Catholic antecedents. My upbringing was nonconformist, to say the least, and without the preference or prejudice of any regional affinities or religious faith. And in this openness of living, unfettered by restrictive boundaries of community affiliations and religious diktat, I was left free to observe and learn from all cultural histories to feed my curiosities as I found need to. I grew up with discourses at mealtimes where discussions would prevail in our home as a daily ritual, and our participation as children into these conversations was always invited. This introduction of being invited from a very young age to hold opinions on varied subjects brought the world of history, politics, current affairs, human rights, literature, cinema, social conduct, economics, etc., as areas to examine and explore. I was left, therefore, to negotiate for myself what I desired would be the perceptions that would shape my intellect and protect my personal freedom and liberty. I was encouraged at a very young age to test my independence and not fear failure in the belief that I would come to know myself, therefore, without excuse or apology, irrespective of my gender. Having always been a vocal advocate of pro-choice and women's rights, I have often been asked what it is like to be born a woman in India, a country so steeped in patriarchy, where both overt and subverted displays of male power are encountered each day in almost all areas and sections of daily life, and whether this wears me down. And my answer is always that I view myself as empowered. I see this as a precious inheritance not to be squandered, and therefore accept the challenge to confront and resist when necessary within my daily life the attempts made by external forces within society that target and infringe upon my territory of equality and freedom. It is by no means easy, and yes, I am sometimes consumed by deep sadness and utter weariness of spirit. But I can never concede defeat and will always desire to stand up and be counted for the issues that I believe need my intervention. What change I am able to instigate through these interventions is not what becomes the sole criterion of importance. Rather, it is the everyday insistence to exemplify through lived experiences the truth of my identification with the ideological position I stand for that becomes supremely important for me. Art was not something I accidentally stumbled upon, nor was it a dispassionate choice either. From the age of 5, I knew I would be a painter, not an artist, but specifically a painter. The reason for this could be attributed to many things, but the point in question I want to make here is that it wasn't that I was greatly skilled or proficient. It was something else. It was this deep-rooted knowledge of my own need for art within my existence that held my connection to it since I was a child. I was also a teenager of the 70s, where the music covers of pop cultural icons like the Beatles were designed by Peter Blake, and fashion designs of Mary Quant became the emblems of the flower power revolution of anti-war slogan protest against the Vietnam War. Indian cinema introduced a wave of art films like Bhumika and Ankur, bringing new realities of perception and aesthetics to engage with, which focused on women's issues and questioned the ethics of an existing patriarchy, which still remains till today in modern India. The 70s and 80s were decades of importance as well for contemporary art in India. Theoretical writing and analytical critique posed questions addressing the problems of colonial influences on our cultural history, creating new paradigms of perception to discourse representations. The intention was not to alter a past history, nor ignore the need to remain engaged and involved with the West, but to recontextualize and find new methodologies by which to articulate aesthetic frameworks of cultural identity through connections with regional and vernacular territories, and to understand the new realities of urban truth within Indian society as it presented itself within the shifting economics of a growing nation. These routes of questioning were charged by the energies of realigning ourselves with the knowledge and understanding of our own political and cultural history with more rigor and without the tropes of sentimental nationalism hijacking these discourses. The Faculty of Fine Arts in Baroda became by de facto a center of major influences within contemporary art during these decades, and it is to this climate that I joined the college in 1976 as a student. I have always maintained that what I learned as an art student has proved invaluable to me throughout these many years, long after I graduated. It was that insisted upon discipline within a classroom to engage us students with exercises that dealt with the basic fundamentals of art through the practice of drawing, painting, sculpture, pottery, printmaking, and applied arts, which offered a familiarity with materials and lessons in skill. Art history was taught in ways that made it seep into your consciousness and offered it as the family tree of ultimate belonging. The objective within all of this was to encourage us to be open to new ways of delivering content and purge dated British academic practices of art education repeating itself. I began my art education at the age of 17, directly after completing my SSc. I mention this because in those days, there were students who came to study art after completing a degree elsewhere in subjects like literature, philosophy, and even commerce. Many of my classmates had completed such degrees and therefore came with varied experiences as mature students, which infused into the system a space of communication that was intellectually more rigorous as a result. The environment within the classroom was charged with an enthusiasm to learn, and long studio hours and common interests forged friendships that established trust and interdependencies. The teaching, whilst I was a student, was exacting, and perhaps more importantly, there was no interference of market forces and other external commercial influences to sidetrack or confuse the process of learning. The agenda of teaching was to use the syllabus to create a stimulating interpretation of its guidelines, thereby making art education relevant and contemporary to the issues of the day, both nationally as well as globally. Debates had begun to be centered on new narrative traditions in painting and sculpture, focusing upon the figure as the central leitmotif with the discourse on human predicament as its primary focus. Paintings engaged with narratives of social and cultural histories mythologized, and an eclectic approach to structuring personal language was employed. Epic narrative traditions of painting and multiple episodic pictorial compilations were used as frameworks to articulate new representations of modernity in a post-colonial cultural context, within which communal issues of violence stained the secular fabric of our nation. Artists were attempting to formulate cultural arguments to address issues of identity. The Baroda narrative figurative artists were at the helm of these national discourses through the practice of their art, their writing, and in public forums and seminars. These artists and their investigative ideational probings revitalized contemporary Indian art greatly. Geeta Kapoor, who was their primary ideologue within this movement, brought a new theoretical, analytical language that framed ways of interpreting our cultural past and positioned the Baroda narrative movement as the new vanguard. As an art student, this pedagogic environment obliged me to read as a daily practice and to inculcate writing as a necessity, both factors that remain crucial to my investigations as an artist till today. These disciplines were important in order for me to interject my reality with more comprehension of its placement within a larger world. But despite this expansiveness of learning that spanned the 5-year BA course at the Faculty of Fine Arts, Baroda, I realized on the completion of it in 1981 that I needed a postgraduate program that could be receptive to my inquiries of feminist issues in a formalized and informed manner. The Faculty of Fine Arts, though charged with the buzz of new ideational energies, did not, however, hold much interest in gender discourse. Women using their life stories as content in art was viewed somewhat as a therapeutic purgation and not seen as a corroborating the recording of oral histories. Important in my personal journey during these years was my need to self-determine self-representation. I was never bohemian, nor conservative, nor willing to fit in for the sake of protocol or conformity. And this insistence to determine the space of the self as I desire it has remained important till date. Within the personal narrative of my life, I married at the age of 18. After my marriage, due to medical reasons that had long-term implications, I was advised to conceive, and so my son Mithun was born on the 2nd of November, 1978, when I was 20 years old. My marriage broke down during my pregnancy, and so I filed for divorce and sole custody of my child, and refused to ask for alimony as I view such financial transactions as being in conflict with my understanding of independence. My divorce was granted in 1983. I met the challenges of being a single parent undeterred, and as Mithun was a much desired and planned addition to my life, there was therefore never any quandary regarding this lifelong commitment of the responsibility to parent and nurture. Being a single parent at such a young age offered me invaluable experiences that propelled my energies with more determined focus than if I had been absent of such responsibilities. Therefore, I always acknowledged the debt I owe to my son, for the gift of this maturity, and for the delight of rediscovering innocence. As an advocate of women's independence, I believe women should be economically self-reliant. I see it as essential for the realization of one's personal dignity, and perhaps more importantly, imperative to the ideals of female empowerment and liberty. Hence, with this as fundamental to my personal philosophy of self-governance, I have been from the age of 18 completely financially independent. I did commercial photography and sold my artworks at nominal prices through alternative venues such as pavement exhibitions organized by us as students, and through architect friends in Baroda who were purchasing for interior projects they were doing for clients. I worked a part-time job at a local art gallery and volunteered to assist at textile and craft exhibitions that came to the faculty premises. I was keenly aware of the need to structure my life in a practical and decisive way that could focus on raising my son in a mature and responsible manner independently, and also define the required discipline to be a committed painter, all the while consciously implementing my feminist position within my lived experiences. Immediately after completing my BFA, I applied for scholarships to study abroad. I joined the master's program at the Faculty of Fine Arts in Baroda, where I was granted permission by Professor Jyoti Bhatt to work separately in a staff studio that was situated close to the library. This structure was like a sabbatical and provided me the space to reflect upon my pictorial language with no interference of academic instruction. It gave me time to discourse about my art with selected teachers on more equal terms. The debates on cultural issues pertaining to modernity in India at the time was something that I carried with me when I went as a student to England to study on an INLAC scholarship at the Royal College of Art in London. My time in London from 1982 to 84 was very important for me, a watershed of sorts, as I no longer felt isolated in the pursuit of a feminist discourse. My pictorial language could find containment within a feminist art history without having to establish its legitimacy as significant. This was hugely relevant for me because my initial instinctual identification with gender politics now found a more formalized structure. Being able to engage with women's issues as a designated area of study offered me experiences through which I could establish the parameters of my own feminist affiliations. Social, cultural, and political histories informed my work as well, and these factors all came together in an analytical convergence, providing me the territory of my subject and the discovery of a collective feminist space that could accommodate legacies of personal significance to me. I found the climate of art in Britain in the 80s interwoven with influences of literature, cinema, theatre, music, performance, theoretical studies, and protest that focused very prominently on feminist concerns. Ecology and the environment, along with anti-nuclear protests and the fight to rid South Africa of the apartheid regime and free Nelson Mandela, were all issues of the women's movement. The separation from India also allowed me to have a critical objectivity in framing my space of belonging within this land of my birth. It was a necessary distance by which I could reassess what was to formulate my personal politics and find the appropriate visual devices by which to articulate my ideas. This shift away from the familiar environment also challenged me to re-examine the structural formation of my figuration and to engage in producing narrative devices that aided my worldview better. How to contextualize from personal and collective histories became an exercise of importance. This need to rigorously confront myself saw me working exhaustively for those 2 years, amassing a body of 200 artworks on completion of my MA at the RCA. During my tenure at the Royal College of Art, I was 24 years old and imbibing lessons as an art student, percolated from the discourses related to a post-colonial context of the Asian subcontinent, where issues of identity and ideas of re-examining vernacular and indigenous sources as references were center stage, and where the notions of non-Western art as being derivative and imitative had become passé. The Festival of India in 1982 and 83 in London brought exhibits of contemporary Indian art that received wide critical acclaim. I witnessed firsthand the emergence of Indian art being viewed with equal parity alongside contemporary Western art, and in some strange way, it felt like a personal validation of a truth well known, finally coming full circle. Though the international art scene was of importance to my formative years of learning, I kept close to my heart at all times the formulations of my inquiries only through gender-conscious prisms. The access to seeing original artworks was perhaps the most beneficial of all the things to my development and space of learning as an artist. I conversed with the art of Joseph Beuys and the American abstract expressionists, as I did with Louise Bourgeois, Yayoi Kusama, and Francis Bacon, Indian miniaturists, the Mexican muralists, and Paul Arrego, amongst a host of others. But what became significant for me in my personal world of interests are the many objects that fill these Western museums. Plundered, looted, borrowed, gifted, brought, they all offer stories known and imagined to be examined within this phenomenon of displacement. The museum as a space of retrieval evokes other orders of power and inheritance and places the dilemma of whether we view these gatherings of cultural property as a means to safeguard their histories being preserved in safekeeping, or whether we are in fact participating in denuding those countries from where the objects originally belonged to in their rightful property. When studying at the Royal College of Art, the painting department was housed in a wing of the Victoria and Albert Museum. As painting students, we had the unique privilege to walk through the mural room and to step inside the V&A as though it was a mere annex of the college. This proximity led to many hours spent in the museum, learning how to decipher from what was taught via art history and attempting to then deconstruct the art one was viewing in order to understand its merits from the objectives of self-interest and personal inquiry. Women authors like Kamala Das, Alice Walker, and Maya Angelou brought to my world the stories of the struggle women face, but equally the joy of belief and the celebration of the female spirit. As an artist, it isn't the theoretical pedagogic that I wish to engage with in my art. My content is culled from the everyday life of the woman, to be perceived and witnessed and acknowledged. I know this to be the space to hold my attention and where the plumb line of my existence must find its equilibrium within the colosseum of collective female histories. It is through the lives of the ordinary that we best witness the ideals of an ideology. From the many stories about the courage of ordinary women, both rural and urban, that have championed women's rights in the subcontinent, I have found my strength. I am angered by the debates that question the relevance of feminist discourse, when in reality, heinous atrocities are committed against women at a staggering statistic of every 1.5 minutes in India, often perpetuated from within those very areas of their existence that should in fact offer safety and protection to both female children and adult women, suggesting therefore that women's rights are not being addressed with the required effectiveness and desire to enforce immediate action for change. So therefore, why did I choose to be a painter instead of working within an area more directly connected with women's issues, considering how strongly I feel about gender equality and related issues pertaining to women's empowerment? Did I believe that art holds the ability to provoke response and reflection in a public domain? For me, my answer is a simple yes. I see for myself that art is the best tool that facilitates my desire to interpolate with an outside world and offers me an infinite scope to mediate my involvement with life. Art is a crucial necessity within all societies as a space of intervention. Mature art holds radical positions that are most definitely impactful, where the potential to strategize arguments, problematize as a method of introspection, confront and be used as a subversive tool all occurs. It also serves to record and chronicle oral histories and offers an insight into the diverse natures of the world that exists. Art crosses boundaries through access to referencing from varied and diverse cultural contexts. Art also acts as a connective device that unifies and heals. It holds the lessons of inclusion that the world really needs to be reminded of repeatedly. As an artist, art history is an infinite territory of belonging for me. It allows me to wander at will through all its passages of time, like a labyrinth within which I alone must know how to find my way to the heart of my own belonging. It is a space where everything I know gets clarified. I observe things minutely at all times. I think this stems from the fact that I do not sketch. So instead, I draw inside my head. I carry these tracings of memory, and they accumulate to become my database of references from which I re-assimilate to form a visual vocabulary of transposed meanings. My work is also influenced by the spirit from the stories that I hear, often spilling out from the television screen in my studio, where the courage of landmine survivors or of dying AIDS patients from a remote village in Africa comes into my life to remind me of what I need to be anchored by. I invite to my attention the awareness of stark realities because it strips away the pretense of denial, and I am always drawn to the stories of survival that have been born from conflict, as it holds for me the potency of belief with greater authenticity. My work have spoken of violence, subjugation, oppression that women face. In works from the 80s, fractured, splintered cartoon-like drawings populated the picture plane, often with graphic sexual imagery woven into the kaleidoscopic, bejeweled presentation of tableaus, becoming like a theater of reenactments, frozen to be committed to one's memory forever, to hold the gaze so as to force the conscience of accountability. I visited the concentration camps at Dachau in Germany, which detail the horrors of the Nazis on the Jews, and it has remained with me ever since as a haunting reminder of how bestial in behavior we are capable of becoming through power, and that these acts of violence never cease as though no lessons have ever been learned. Women within war often become easy targets to attack through rape. However, the spirit of the woman is indomitable as they continue to commit their energies to nurture life through their amazing capacity to define self-dignity and offer lessons of forgiveness, to remain the possessors of Shakti and find their empowerment unaided. The female figure as a central image is therefore not accidental, nor arrived at by chance in my work. It is consciously placed as an endorsement of female victory, almost as a totemic trophy of the self for the self, to reinforce the embodiment of the female spirit as a vital access to life itself. The female figure, often in isolation, represents the perpetuity of their life-giving force that bears witness to the passage of time unfolding. As an artist, I understand and associate my connection with the world through the lens of humanism. In my representation of the woman, I iconize the female figure By diagrammatizing her body, therefore removing the palpable corporality so that it does not become a commodity for lustful consumption. By iconizing the female figure rather than offering a naturalistic representation, it allows me the space of separation, like that used within our sculptural traditions. I pare the female body down to its essential and invest it with an impregnable space where it exists with its own aura of self-containment. The unflinching gaze and the frontal posture of these female protagonists demand that the viewer is obliged to participate and engage with its presence. Yet the figure remains untouched by outward censure. Stark and arresting in demeanor, these figures with their unrelenting gaze stand like protective guardians of the universe. My work is informed by the personal politics that governs my life. The narratives in my works are never direct stories, but are territories that hold parables through which meanings are inferred. I employ the use of metaphors, allegory, myth, and legends to formulate its content. In a series of work, with the photographic image appears within the contours of the body, which becomes sites of retrieval of personal histories. Traced like mappings of a territory, these contours are lifted from previous paintings, archived as an archaeological site is. The montage of images lace together quite literally to become the second skin. The painted faces of these figures become masks to an otherwise personal space of autobiographic deliverance. Site-specific and project-related works, travel and residencies infuse my art practice with spaces of confrontation that challenge my own vulnerability in different ways and which force new devices of approach and resolution to be considered. My fascination with the notions of retrieval resurfaced through the suite of works titled Pages from a Diary, within which my self-image inhabits the museum as a personal mausoleum of ancestries. The images that I create or rephrase becomes a personalized visual lexicon invested with specific symbology that over time maps the preoccupations and arguments that constitute the ideological premise of my identity. My work at all times becomes alternative playgrounds of notional strategies where displacement is addressed and negotiated and new belongings sought. These locations of inquiry are somewhat like ephemeral love affairs that are not intended to be conclusive, yet pitch your senses to become exquisitely aroused and allow you to conjure the hope of eternity. India never allows me to ferment in the sleep of my own desires, but keeps me ever wakeful to a consciousness that embroiders patterns that decorate my body and my soul and anoints me as the bride of its soil. Born wrapped in the placenta of many cultures, I breathe a life of knowingness uniquely different from those chaste tongues of scriptures and divides. From the gullies and shanties, dark shadows pattern the cities like fake lace of a bridal gown, whilst the wail of sirens block out the screams of the innocent, whose spilt blood are the only reminders of their vanquished dreams. Legacies of a past cannot hold the brace of my spine upright, nor does the stoop of my weariness find me my bed of comfort. As my body wrinkles and my breasts become heavy with the stories of all those I carry close to my heart, I listen, wakeful ever, just for the smallness of hope. Thank you so much.
It feels so great to having you over here, and I'm also from Baroda, so I can understand the story of expression. So I have a question that I'm living here for the 3 months, and as your work talk about the gender dispute and the equality, so what do you talk, like, how it is going in Kerala? I don't want to ask, but I should.
I think each of us have to place ourselves within our contexts that we choose, or whether they become those of circumstance, and create spaces of rhythm that make sense to us. There is no formula. It's important as creative people, just to use that word very loosely, whether you're an architect or a writer, theater production person, filmmaker, whatever it may be. You are obliged in many ways to become a kind of interpreter of sorts. But that interpretation comes from a mediation with the self. And the self is a very unique space. It's conditioned and influenced by many things, but it equally is a space that can stand apart. That's what makes the human mind so complex. So I don't have a formula for you. What I do think is necessary is that it depends on how you choose to structure yourself as an individual. It's extremely important to be disciplined. It's extremely important to be self-critical. But it's equally important to hold gratitude for having the sort of spirit of life, because I'm not religious, so I can't call it anything else. Because it's pointless to squander experiences and opportunities by sort of sitting in a space of denial about what one can do with these experiences. So I'll just try to say something that hopefully doesn't sound too motherly, but I have always done this for myself. All of us feel sorry for ourselves, and all of us feel that we're having, a rough time and whatever it is. But for me, it's very important to recognize how privileged I am. That's point one. And the other thing is to always find an image or a memory or a recollection that may not be personal, that could belong anywhere in this world, that holds something that is so different and really makes you focus on how trivial your own space of anxieties are. I have a particular image that I've held for many years. It's an image, a photographic journalistic image of landmine victims, children whose bodies are truncated, they don't have legs, they have stumps. And they're playing soccer, they're playing football. And the joy on their face. Now you tell me, I don't think your experiences or mine could be anything like that. So we need to just take stock of who we are.
Rekha, that was a brilliant presentation, and I feel really honored that I've heard this today. I don't really have a question. I think I was just thinking about whether you can talk a little bit about your, I think it's quite apparent that the work is very autobiographical, it's political, it's historical, it's all of those things. I was just wondering if you can reflect a bit about the practice, how your practice has developed and how you have shaped it consciously as a work practice, as a labor, and how you might have. I'm not sure if that's.
Thank you so much. I'm a very boring person. I'm a workaholic. I sleep only 3-4 hours a day, and so I don't know whether I'm the best person to give you advice, but I firmly believe that anybody's practice, whatever you choose to do, you could be a gardener, you can be a homemaker, you can make papads. I have no hierarchy of anything. I just feel that for anyone who has the privilege of making a choice, where you decide that this is something that I choose to do, then you really need to be able to address that practice, whatever it may be, with a commitment, and a commitment that can take into account many things. Please make money. Nobody says, I'm not shy or coy about money. But it should not become the entirety of everything, where you finally prostitute your values and your politics and your ethics for that. In that case, then I would prefer to have a tiffin service. I would perhaps make more money because I cook, possibly. So it's what you really need to do in any practice, and I'm saying this because I see a lot of young people sitting here, is that you need to have an ethics, you need to have a determination, and you also need to have a curiosity to be open and to accept that the unfamiliar is what will teach you. I think you need to bring into your world things that challenge you, that frighten you, that make you feel inept. You need to read, you need to historicize. I think much as I love technology, it's also become the albatross, you know. I was sitting with somebody in the car today, very sweetly, one of the young people, and he wanted somebody's number. And I had it open, and he said, "Can you send it to me?" And I said, "Why don't you just write it down? You know, I mean, it's open, you know. I don't need to close it and then send it to you." Because we've become so reliant on these kind of formula ways of you know, existing. And we've taken away the personal endeavor. So my life and my practice, I'm very house proud. I keep a very clean home. I'm, you know, all of those very boring things. And I work 14, 15 hours a day on my art practice. I teach because I believe that there is a vacuum of good teaching. There's really not enough committed teachers, but I don't take money for my teaching. I'm arrogant. I don't like to be purchased. So I'm a very tough teacher. Most of my students cry, but then most of my students understand who they are finally. So I think we learn from discovery. I hate people saying that my child is talented. I refuse to judge art competitions. I think it's the most crass thing to do. People need to understand that anything you desire can be embraced, and you can become the best of your capability, but you have to work the hours. So I think my practice has evolved through a process of desiring to know myself better. And I think that's a lifelong commitment. And when I talk about the self, it's not necessarily about Rekha Rodwittiya, but it's about the self in relation to, you know, the existence I'm within. I am born as a post-independence child, and so I've seen India changing. I've seen the economics changing. We're now part of a political climate that is something I never believed I would be part of when I was in my 20s. So, you know, you're often surprised in ways that may not necessarily be the best of surprises, but you learn to negotiate with it. So I don't know if I answered your question, but.
I was very fascinated by your paintings. I'm seeing it for the first time. What interested me was three things. One, in many of the paintings, there's a lack of perspective, decontextualized kind of painting. Secondly, the grotesque. In some of the paintings, I found an element of grotesque in the female faces. Thirdly, the naked woman. I've heard Kamala saying that when she started painting, and most of her paintings had naked women, and people started asking her why the naked woman. She said, you know, for me, nakedness connotes innocence. So does it connote vulnerability? What exactly does it mean? Could you please explain?
I'm not certain I understand your question perfectly, but let me try to answer it. For me, the removal of the garment is where you take away everything and you stand so completely, without any tropes or any, disguise. But it's, as I said in my paper, the desire is to sort of create that space where the woman is not identified with in terms of, I use the word naked as you do too. I don't use the word nude. I find the word nude problematic for me because it has its own historical connotation. So the nakedness as a word in a literary sense is that which has nothing left to show. It is that what it is. And I think that it's not just about vulnerability, it has that as well, but I think strength and vulnerability are two things that are, you can't have one without the other. You can't be a strong person unless you are willing to examine your vulnerability. So I think that that's a sort of implicit. I think that I'd like to believe that the female figure stands as a representation of many things, life-giving, an edifice of time. I don't know whether I can give it a greater explanation than that. She's also the protagonist, and she's attached And the autobiography is not only about myself. I remember many years ago, people would ask me whether I was painting about myself, and I said, it's as autobiographical as I am woman. So, as I am woman, it is autobiographic, but it's not about me. It is about the space of gender.
First of all, phenomenal work. I mean, it's amazing to see how you interpreted what you've actually said in all your painting. It's like spot on. I don't think you need to write about it. I think it's very evident in your form of art what you're trying to say. I could be wrong where I've understood that there was a shift in the style of work during the before and the after, in terms of during a certain years, and then there was a little more intensity in the first series of work that you did, and later it just still became very calm, but yes, again making a statement. I think both of them are brilliant, but what I'm trying to say is that an evident, is that a intentional shift? Sorry if I did.
No. Thank you, George. There's something to do with the decades that you live in. So when you're 20 years old, I'm 60 today. So when you're 20 to 30, you hold certain types of needs and certain types of necessities by which you create your articulation. Writer, illustrator, architect, whatever. The articulation you have is based on those needs. And there is a certain stridentness that you have when you're young. There is a necessity to have that pitch. And I think that the works that you refer to, especially in London, where they're fractured and, violent and sexually graphic. I'm talking about alienation and, all of those things, power structures via sexuality. But then, it's like, for those who are parents, try telling your child the same thing that you need to tell them the same way, they don't listen. So there's a kind of need you have, to find how to talk about the same thing, but to find a way to do it differently. And I think I say this very often, that I'm a very boring artist because I have a very tiny premise. So like a gardener, the soil is just turned and I try to grow different things, but it's all in the same patch of land. So yes, you're right. I think there are certain times when you structure language, and after all, it is language, when you're sitting with friends, you'll have a yar language, whatever the equivalent in Malayalam is, a dost language. But when you're talking, meeting somebody for a project or a brief, you want to giggle and laugh at something that looks odd, but you hold it, and you wouldn't do that in a space where another articulation allows for it. I think India is at an interesting time right now. We're all of us trying to find ways to articulate things we want to say that need to be said. And it's not just through art, it's through, everyday living. And how do you find a way to restructure in these very difficult times? So it obliges you to think differently. Thank you so much.